Morning, everyone. Today we are finishing up our discussion on market structure. Specifically, we will be looking today at what happens when the market structure affects us. Okay, what do we call it? How can it affect us? What happens when markets affect the outside world? Okay, that is what we're going to be looking at today. It says students will be able to explain the characteristics of, forgot to change that, I'm sorry, y'all. Students will be able to explain the differences between positive and negative externalities and understand the idea of public goods. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. Specifically, the majority of our conversation will be looking at market failures. What happens when the economy, or excuse me, when the markets rather don't do what they're supposed to do? And it says some of the most common market failures include inadequate competition, so monopolies, right? We said a monopoly last class. We said monopolies are industries that are operated by one company. They hold the share business in that particular industry. Maybe it's inadequate information. They don't give you all the information that you need in order to be able to adequately determine where you want to buy a good. Maybe it's resource immobility. That sounds complicated, right? But basically it's where the resources cannot be moved from one area of the world to another in order for the other places of the world in order to make those particular goods. Okay? Resource immobility. Externalities. An externality is an effect on the economy or environment, whether positive or negative, based on the actions of the markets. And public goods. Okay, what happens when everything is shared and controlled by no one? Okay, so I told you the other day, our last discussion, that all of these market structures are based upon competition. Okay, competition we know is a good thing. The more competitors, the better the prices, the better the product we're going to receive. So what happens when we have inadequate competition? Okay, what happens when we have inadequate competitions? It says consequences of decreasing competition. Inefficient resource allocation. Ooh, Lordy, that sounds complicated. What does that mean? Guys, it means we can't determine where we're going to be able to use the goods, those natural resources, or resources in general in the most effective means. If I have wood, what market would actually be the most effective use, where we wouldn't be wasting our resources? Okay, that is what resource allocation means. How much wood are we going to use for this particular industry, for that particular market, for this market, for that market? How much does each market need? And maybe it's where we're giving too much resources to one market and not enough to another. So if we give all of our resources to making houses, we have none to make pencils. Okay, that is resource allocation. Okay, higher prices. If there's not enough competition, we're going to see higher prices. Now, not only higher prices, guys, but we're also going to see higher prices on purpose. Okay, not that it costs more to make the good. Okay, they are purposefully inflating prices because they know that they are the only ones that sell the product. Okay, economic and political power. So think back to our examples of John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. If you had Mr. Crampton, you talked about trusts. He told me his example. He said in his example, they brought up the barbecue place, right? Where in this Fat Boys Barbecue, or whatever he happened to call it, I forget. They needed steel. They needed places to be able to distribute their products, so they needed a railroad, and they were all trusting in each other, right? Hey, I'll do business with you and you alone, right? I'll do business with you and I'll do business with you. And we're only going to do business with each other, not with anybody else. Okay, those were trust, right? All right, so, and if you didn't have Mr. Crampton, I can't speak of what happened in Mr. Adams' class. I can't speak of what happened in Miss Petway's class, but I know if you had Mr. Crampton, I know you talked about trust and J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and how much power they actually had in those particular industries, whether it was railroad or steel. Like huge amounts of power. And it's all because of the lack of competition in those particular areas. Okay? All right. So, if we have inadequate information, okay, meaning businesses are not telling us about their product, they're not telling us about how their product is made, what is in their product, we have inadequate information, because that leads to market failures. And we don't know about the product. Isn't that why, if you look on the back of a can, why it tells you exactly what's in there? You know exactly what is in that product. Now, if that wasn't on there, would that affect which products we buy? It might. It might affect what products we buy. But not only that, guys, not only what products we buy, but think about it. If we didn't have this information available to us about different products, would it be hard for another company to enter that market? If they don't know what the product is, how can they say I want to make a product similar to that? Because they have no idea what's in it. They have no idea how to make it. They have no idea at all. Okay, so you've got to have adequate information about what's going on in that market. And without that inadequate information where we can know exactly how many competitors there are, exactly what's in the products that are being made, that lack of information, remember the identical products, when we're looking at our barriers to entry and how similar the products are, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, is that information that we need to know, and without that information, we have a market failure. A resource and mobility can't get the resources you need from one area to another in order to effectively distribute the power in those particular industries. Let me give you an example. If U.S. Steel was the only was one of the main steel companies in the United States, and it was, if all the resources were in the area in which U.S. Steel was located, could anybody else enter the market? Can anybody else establish a steel industry when all the resources needed to make steel were in one area, and that area happened to be where U.S. Steel was located? Extremely difficult, guys. That is another market failure. Okay, we cannot get the resources we need in order to adequately compete in that particular market. Says factors of production cannot move easily to markets where they'd be most profitable. So, if U.S. Steel is not making things effectively, but another company is, but they can't get the steel that they need, see the problem there? U.S. Steel can jack the prices up, even though they're wasting those natural resources, and they're not going to be able to get, the other companies are not going to be able to get the products that they need in order to make that product, even though they make it more effectively and more a better product. Okay, so it's all about who controls the resources. Okay, now externalities is another market failure. Externalities, guys, is unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. Now, why Does Miss Harris spend so much time on externalities? Ooh, unintended consequences. What was our third rule of economics? Anybody remember? Probably not, because that was a little while ago. But our third rule of economics is people's choices have what? People's choices have consequences. Whether positive or negative, people's choices have consequences. They have consequences in our businesses. When we make choices in a business, they have consequences. Whether positive or negative, whether cost or benefit, they have consequences. Now, most people will only think about the negative consequences or those negative externalities. All right, that is the harmful cost to an unintended group of people. Okay, so these people are not the makers. They are a random third-party group, mainly the who? Consumers, right? Us, the consumers. We know we're not the producers. We have to deal with the negative actions of these businesses. Maybe it's pollution. Maybe it's noise pollution. This morning, last night, y'all, at 11:30 at night. Airplane leaving Montgomery. Lord Jesus, I was not happy because that plane, I live in Millbrook, y'all. I could hear it. And I was not happy. I was almost asleep. Okay, so maybe it's noise pollution. If they're doing construction work in an area, and that area happens to be near your house, are you going to have to deal with the consequences? Y'all, you remember me telling you about all the construction here at school? Oh, I can't even tell you how many times I got tired of hearing the saws, the machines, the impact wrench. Y'all, I'm tired of hearing it. Because it was in my breezeway, that was a negative externality to me, right? I had to hear it. Now, I'm going to give you a famous example. Has anybody seen The Lorax by Dr. Seuss? I normally show The Lorax, and I may show you the cartoon, the book version, not the motion picture version, where they cut down all the trees. Yeah, I don't know. Dr. Seuss? I'll show you Dr. Seuss. We'll look at the Lorax. By cutting down all the trees. If we clear trees to make houses, if we clear trees to make businesses, what's going to happen to the effect on the environment? Well, we have smog. We can't clear out the pollution, right? Because that's what trees do. We can't get that fresh, clean air anymore. That is a negative externality. Okay? My husband's whole job, is a negative externality, y'all. My husband is a hazardous waste inspector for the state of Alabama. He literally goes around to make sure they're not dumping hazardous waste. Is that a negative externality? Absolutely, it's a negative externality. And it is a negative externality to who? Us. Because it affects our environment. That's my husband's whole job. That's what he does for a living. Is inspects for hazardous waste. Dealing with negative externalities. Okay? But are all externalities negative? Well, no. New businesses coming to town, that's an externality. It affects us, right? It's an unintended consequence. But it's a positive consequence, not a negative. All right? We're going to have more places to shop, more job opportunities are being created. I just saw where on the corner of I-85 and Zelda Road, where Bojangles is going to be opening back up and hiring, although that's a terrible location. Not all the externalities are negative. Okay, some are positive. Now, another market failure is going to be a public good. Public goods, guys, are goods that are consumed by everyone that nobody pays for. Nah, not that we don't pay for them, okay? We do pay taxes, but you don't have to directly pay them, okay? I don't go out, and when I have to use the police department, I don't slip him a $20 bill, right? That's not how it works. Okay, so public goods are goods that are shared by everybody. Now, why would these be an externality? Or, excuse me, a market failure? Crowded. Maybe there's too few of them. With our police department and our fire department. Crowded highways. Okay? We don't directly pay for them, but everybody gets to use them. Okay, let me give you another example. At the beginning of the year, typically I have my students read an article called Tragedy of the Commons. Tragedy of the Commons. You're thinking, dear Lord, what is a common? Guys, a common is a park, a common area where people can come and play. All right, come and work, whatever. All right, so in the Tragedy of the Commons, specifically the video that I use, not the article, it talks about how the Native Americans, when we first started America, when we first come to America, think about pilgrims, right? We all know the story of the first Thanksgiving, where they were all lived, where they all shared the fruits of their harvest. No, I'm sorry, they almost starved to death, right? Sorry, it didn't really work that way. When everybody gets shared, what happens? Everybody takes all they want. Think about Halloween. Halloween's coming up, right? Typically in a non-pandemic year, some people would put bowls of candy out and people could come and get their candy and leave, right? Well, what happens? People do what? Take as much as they want and don't give it to anybody else. Don't leave any for anybody else, right? So, when this common area was shared by the Native Americans, everybody took everything they wanted. All they wanted, right? It was a glorious thing. But some people almost starved to death. So how was it glorious? Okay, what we figured out is that in a commons or with public goods, it doesn't truly satisfy the needs and the wants of the people. Everybody is not going to get equal access to those commons areas, okay, or to the public goods. Okay, maybe if you live in the country, let me give you another example. I said the police department, right? Okay, so if you live in the country, are you going to have greater access or less access to the police department? Well, less, right? It's going to take them longer to get there. Typically, there's no city police officers like in Montgomery. You might have the sheriff, the county sheriff's department, but it's going to take them a while to get to you. Okay? So that is one of the problems with public goods, is that everybody shares them and nobody's needs or wants are directly met. Okay? So, with that, guys, that ends our discussion of market failures. You have a quiz in the folder for Chapter 7. I will not do a major test grade. You have a 50-point quiz. All right? Because Chapter 7 is very short. And that ends our discussion of market structures.